This podcast is brought to you by On Track Studio.
Welcome, Sohail, to Whose Future Is This? It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. And before we get started, I'm going to ask you to share a story about your name. But before we do, I wanted to tell people a little bit about you. You're a political scientist. You are also being voted one of the world's best futurists through the L'Oreal Award, maybe 12 years ago.
Yes.
And I think that is like indicative of how long you've also been a futurist. You were one of the very first futurists I ever met. And when I did meet you, I didn't actually know that you had traveled the world working with governments and different cultures and groups doing futures work. So I might share a little bit about the story about how we met. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask you to share the story behind your name.
So growing up, we moved from Pakistan to Indiana. And so as year two, my name was Sohail Haider. Then it became Sohail Chaudhry. Then it became Sohail Inayatullah. And this was because in Pakistan, you don't have a last name. So my father kept on trying different last names until he settled on his first name. So we just took his first name.
That's his first name? Inayatullah is his first name?
Yeah. So he was just Inayatullah. That was his name. And so I became Sohail Inayatullah. And so this was quite intriguing. Now, in our village, when I went to my dad's village, there was someone who's a genealogist. And he recites the names going back, I think, 1,000 years. And he starts the first few minutes, they're all Muslim names in the village. Then after a while, he goes on, and suddenly all the names are Sikh. Singh, Gobinder Singh, etc., etc. Then he keeps on going, and finally they all become Hindu names, Malik, etc. And so immediately you can see how the names in our particular village have transitioned over the last 1,000 years. And so personally with my dad, when we switched names, I just, you would, as a 7-year-old writing in your class notebook, first and last name, every year I had to change it. And finally I was glad we settled on one.
How did he change, like, the other names that he had chosen? Do you know how he came to those ones before he settled on Inayatullah?
Yes, the Chaudhry was just like a title. And Haider was his stepfather's name. And Inayatullah was his name. So finally he decided he's just going to go with his first name.
Yeah.
And just keep it that way.
And Sohail, what about the first name?
That's from my mother. I mean, that means one who can go with ease to the other side.
Oh, how fitting.
So and the other side.
When I met you, you were known as Subodh, which was a Sanskrit name. And what does Subodh mean?
So that was a name given by a spiritual teacher. It means one who has intuition of the divine, who can intuit what's the most wise.
Both Sohail and Subodh are very fitting names for you from what I have known of you and my journey with you. Thank you so much for sharing. That's very intriguing.
Yeah, I think part of the name tells us who we are, but also where we're going. And in our case, the impermanence of the name, how it changes over time. So the name is not fixed per se. It's naming something as opposed to being something. I think that's kind of what future studies is about. How we change, how change creates us.
Totally. And I haven't even thought about it, but I've had quite a lot of name changes as well. And I never even took my husband's name. So I could have been Cherie Talianides. I was born Cherie Loader, which was after my father. And then when I was very young, I was named Minicon from my mum's second husband and the father who grew me up. And it was really interesting because when I went to get my passport, had been no formal name changes. So there were all these issues because I'd been Minicon for so long that they'd just given me a bank account and stuff because all the kids' names were in Minicon, but it caused all these complications around my name. And I really like that. I like that way you see it.
So our being names change, but then there's fixed structures, the world of passports, visas, government regulations, which force us into a particular identity, even if we wish to recreate an identity and become the future we wish to see.
Yeah, and I used to see that a lot when I was teaching international students, and you would get a lot of students changing their names. And it was very interesting, the names they chose, like Kylie or Tiffany. It was really interest in the name changes. And there was a big conversations in class actually about where that need to change the name was coming from. And was it something that they were giving up because they wanted to, or because they wanted to fit in with a different society and those sorts of things. So it was, yeah, I really like that link between the naming and futures thinking. So I might move into that a little bit. How do you describe what it is that you do as a professional futurist?
Well, future studies is the study of alternative and preferred futures and the worldviews and myths that underlie them. So I've been teaching 4 years at Tom Kung University, which has a formal BA and master's program and now PhD program in future studies. And so there, the notion there is the world is changing. Let's understand how this world is changing. Let's move from structure, here's the world given to us, to agency, here's how we can create the world. Now, many
Yeah.
people like futures for the litany or the superficial dimension, which is forecasting, quantitative analysis, but futures is also the power to name a different future, the ability to have agency to change.
Yeah. And so how do you use the future in a way that scaffolds people's thinking and ideas about the future to create the pathways towards the futures they want or away from the ones that they don't want? How do you actually, through your work, I guess, cultivate that agency?
I think the way exactly how that works there. So first, most organizations or research projects, they want to map how the world is changing. Once they've mapped how the world is changing, then think, this world is changing. How do we fit into this change? If we do nothing, here's where we'll go. If we do X, Y, Z, here's where we'll go. And if we truly transform, here's where we could go. So with any organization or business or individual, there's moving from no choice to many choices.
Yeah.
Now, the nature of choices changes based on whether it's a business, a government, or a person. So we use different methods from scenarios to CLA to backcasting to visioning to help determine that choice. And it changes as per project.
Can you share an example?
I think I know, for example, in the Australia context, many years ago, I spoke at Double. It was a mayor's conference. There were 550 mayors, local councillors, planners there. And the Minister of Local and Regional Planning, I believe, had me there. And he had his staff there as well with him. And after the first 5 minutes, it became very clear the participants didn't like the speech. And they proceeded to yell things out, get angry, and over time they became drunk. So I was in a room full of 550 very aggressive people, at least half of them. Half were just clapping and loved it, but half really were stirred up. The minister's team left the room. They just ran out. They saw what was going on, quickly ran to the door, and I could see out the corner of my eye a nice black limousine taking them away. And later they apologized. They said, I think you would have preferred for us to stay. And I was like, yeah, I felt frightened and threatened. Then the next day I met some of the mayors. I said, that wasn't much fun. He goes, I want to apologize on behalf of local and regional council mayors. We were very rude to you. And I said, so why were you rude? And they said, well, you were presenting ideas that were too challenging. Things like the rise of veganism, cellular agriculture, demographic shifts in the world, all threatened us too much. And so I took that on board. One, was something wrong with them, but as a futurist, we always inquire, how could I have done this differently? So I had a similar project in Roma, Queensland, and Dalby, Queensland, and understanding now that farming groups see foresight not as excitement but as risk, that how do we reframe this to bring everyone on board? So as we did this process, we started to ask, well, what can you do with new tech differently? So one idea, one of the mayors is, we need drones to be able to quickly see what Queensland roads are going bad, need reconstruction. Another Queensland leader, he said, here's our situation. If it's true the rise of cellular agriculture, veganism, maybe we need to move towards medical cannabis as a product. And a third leader said, okay, our problem is our farmers are making decisions with low information. Let's recast this every Queensland farmer becomes a scientist. And another one was, how do we use AI to ensure that farmers have latest data on prices, on climate change, etc. So we made sure this time to go slower, understand the felt and the threat, and use the ideas to build strategies and possibilities that could enhance their ability to navigate this world.
Yeah.
And we also ensured, I was lucky this time. In one of the tables was looking at the future of food. I believe one of the counselors was the owner of an abattoir. And next to him, one of the council employees, she was a vegan. So they're on the same table, so they had to negotiate. Neither one could really attack the other as being wrong. So they were the group that started to think about medical cannabis as a possibility. Both understood the world was changing. So part of our work is to get novel ideas, new ideas, but in situations where people feel safe to move forward, as opposed to the double example, which is still one of my favorites, where no one felt safe.
How could we use some of these other futures methods and tools to have that scaffold, that conversation? And there was things when I think back to when I first learnt about future studies, because how I learnt about it was actually I met you and on the outskirts of Stanthorpe in a little pink room and you were running a workshop on the future of education. And I remember thinking, wow, this guy talks about history quite differently. And you were showing the images of different classrooms and I was quite intrigued by it. And then I went and fell pregnant with my first daughter, and we were coming up to Queensland, and I remember Sam saying, we should catch up with Sohail and Ivana and this, and I was like, oh, okay. But I had a meltdown while I was there. So Sam had me trekking through the rain, 3 months pregnant. Then he decided to eat the last bit of chocolate that was in the hotel room. And that set me off. And I was like, I'm not catching up with anyone. I'm done for the day. And of course, Sam goes and rings you and says, I don't think we're going to come. I actually eat chocolate. And you said, tell her to come. Tell her to come. I have chocolate from all around the world. And I came over and there was chocolate from all around the world there. And it was through that conversation, munching on chocolate, that I actually learnt more about what it was you were actually doing around the world. And then that's when I went, oh, how can I learn more about this? And you sent me on the pathway to learn more about Future's work.
There's chocolate here so the method we use is CLA, right?
Okay, I'm sure listeners are wondering what CLA actually is, so I thought I'd better just take a second here to explain what CLA is before we continue the conversation. CLA stands for Causal Layered Analysis, and Sohail actually created this method. It's a futures method and tool that can be used in multiple ways in multiple settings. I'm going to put information in the show notes that explains CLA and how you can apply it for those that are interested. For me personally, I like to use it to map an issue in its current present day reality and use it as a way to then look at the future of how we can solve that issue. I use it to unpack different perspectives on an issue, because whatever issue we might be focused on, different people will have different ways of seeing and viewing it, and it's important to be able to unpack that to be able to then go, okay, well, how do we transform this if we've all got really different ideas around the causes of the issue and that kind of thing. If you were a coach working with individual clients, if you were a facilitator working with different groups around a particular issue. The power of CLA is it works at looking at 4 different levels. So you have the surface level of an issue, you have the systematic causes of the issue, you have the story and the worldviews that underpin that issue, and you have the myths and metaphors that also underpin that issue. To create transformational change, we need to be operating at all those 4 levels. So you need to have equal weight on all of those different levels when you're focusing on change. So let me give you an example. If you were to look at a complex issue like the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the child protection system, the surface layer would sound something like this. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 10 times more likely to be removed than non-Aboriginal children. So the surface level is usually a newspaper headline or a statistic that we hear over and over again. At the systems level, you're looking at what are the causes for the issue? And so we've looked at things like intergenerational impacts of stolen generation, They've led to alcohol and drug addiction and things like that to cope with the pain of removal. The stories that underpin that at the third level are things like colonization. And then at the myth metaphor level, Vanessa Turnbull Roberts often sums up the whole issue as the family policing system. Now, that could be seen as one perspective. You could use CLA to map multiple other ideas around how that issue is framed, or you could use it then to go, okay, so what do we want it to be though? A new metaphor might be something like takes a village to raise children, and I often hear that one. So then what's the new story around that? What does that sound like? And what are the systems and structures that we need to put in place to be able to see that metaphor come to life? And what do we want the new newspaper headlines and new statistics to look like? This can be a really powerful, especially when you're doing it in a room full of people with different ideas and different solutions, about just doing it in a really structured, systematic way with people. So at an individual level, if you were, say, a life coach working with an individual, you might want them to write down what are some negative thoughts that they have in their head, thoughts that they repeat over and over again, things that they tell themselves about themselves. So let's take the example of, I can't do anything because what if I get it wrong? Maybe you never get to see your potential because you just keep it all hidden away. At the story level, there's something going on. The story is like, I'm not enough as I am. And that at a myth metaphor level, it might be Little Miss Perfect. It's about the perfectionist in someone. So to change that story, it's not enough to tell someone, just change the thought. You have to change not just the thought, you have to change the systems, you have to change the story, and you have to find a way more empowering metaphor to move forward. I'm not going to go through what that might look like now because there's still heaps of the chat with Sohail to move on with, but it gives you an idea of how you can apply this tool in different ways. Anyhow, Sohail unpacks some more examples as we continue the conversation, so let us get back to that.
So there's the superficial dimension. Here's X. So the project both of us worked on together many years ago with the state's health system. Mm-hmm. And they want, the Futures Workshop officially was about inclusion through asking Indigenous persons and others quantitatively how many Indigenous nurses will we need in 2040. So it's very much about using Indigenous persons to gather data for, in their view, more effective strategy to meet the needs of citizens.
Yep.
So that's how it was framed. CLA says, we understand that. We understand your needs for quantitative data for the official future, but it forces people into deeper spaces. So what's behind that? If my memory is correct and you were part of it, the workshop shifted when we did the CLA game and someone stood up and said, well, it's not number of nurses, but nothing changes until there's an Aboriginal Prime Minister. Yeah. And then it shifted from number of nurses needed for changing health needs, which is important, to actually political social power. Yeah. So a project we did with Ivana Milojevic with Asia Development Bank, they said, right now we're counting women. It's about representation. And that's important, of course. But actually, when they shifted the story, they said, actually, it's woman count. And this became an issue of empowerment. So future starts off as the data part, forecasting, what are the alternatives, but we always try to shift to this deeper part. And the main thing that at the worldview level, we're not doing it. It has to be co-designed. So this is where CLA becomes a powerful futures tool for change. Now, it can be used as social justice, the way me and you were talking about it, but in a minor way, I had one. She was the managing director for one of Australia's largest banks. And she was having an international meeting for their international branch. And she said, okay, I'm making a pitch for new innovation. How do I do this when everyone's flying in? I said, do you know the story of each one of your 7 board members? And she goes, I don't. I go, so figure out their core story, who they are. And then she came back. She goes, I got it. Person 1, he's a data scientist. He's not going to care about anything else but profits that this will lead to. Story 2 is a storyteller. He wants to know the story of banking, how this will change banking in the world. Person 3, she said, he's just, he's want to know the infrastructure of AI and data. He wants to know the details. How will this work? So then she said in her meeting, she crafted a strategy so each of the board members would get what they needed. So she understood her story as the kind of the catalyst here, of knowing, the deeper knowing, and then she figured out what each one of them needed. So this is kind of what we did in that workshop. Each one has a different view. If I wish to be successful, I need to understand their view, than to try to move towards a win-win solution if possible. Sometimes it's not.
And so each of those people kind of represented those different CLA levels in a way.
Yes, yeah, it was intriguing. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yes. And you
Yeah,
get that in a room. Yeah, you get the philosophers, the storytellers, the data people. That people
yeah,
is interesting, but how do I get the engineer to design it?
yeah.
And by her being attentive to that, mindful of that, she said she was more effective in getting what she wanted, this new innovation off the ground.
Yeah.
That's opposed to her or me or someone going and said, I have the answer, I'm the expert, here's how we're going to do it.
Gosh, I think I need to think about that a little bit more because of my current role is such it's in such an operational environment where strategy and that big picture thinking, there's not much space for it. So I need to maybe think about it through that lens with some of the way I approach that work. Now, there's something that I would love for you to explain a little bit because I remember finding this really interesting when I was learning about future studies. You talk about the different type of futures. You talked about different types of futures thinking and different types of future uses, kind of like you talked about the borrowed future, the used future. I'm just wondering for most of the listeners here have never been exposed to the world of future studies or futures thinking. I was wondering if you could share a little bit.
If we look at critical success factors, whether it's for a person, organization, or nation, the first one we say is see the future as a learning journey. Most people say, well, just tell us the future. It's the future as a crystal ball. And once we have to explain to them, well, we don't have a crystal ball. We can help you move from zero loop learning, where we give you data, you double down because you have a worldview that doesn't accept scientific data. And then we say, well, but the data is coming at you. The world is changing. And if they're good, they go to single loop learning, which is a plan. But in a world of heterogeneous change, rapid change, you need more than a plan. Double loop learning, learning about learning, that's learning about the future. So we ask them, what's impossible today, but if possible, changes everything. That moves people from I'm stuck in the present to I'm learning from the future, learning from the impossible. So that starts to shifts the energy. But as we shift the energy, we often go back to the used future. Used future is institutional practice that doesn't work, but we keep on doing it.
What would a personal used future, like at a personal level, like used future potentially be? How would you describe it in that context?
So say something I'm doing, you're doing, they're doing that doesn't work, but we keep on doing it.
Like eating too much chocolate when you're trying to lose weight.
If that's an issue. But it could be, the used future could be losing weight.
That's true. That's true.
See, that's
Diet
what's
is
uncertain.
not a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. The litany is less chocolate. But what's underneath it? What's the core metaphor? I don't accept myself. The better metaphor could be I love me as me. And then the issue is not more or less chocolate. The issue is foods that sustain me, foods that make me happy. And this is a better story, then we tend to not always move to a situation that's more fulfilling. So the use future is whatever practice I'm doing, you're doing, we're doing that doesn't work.
Yep.
We just keep on doing it. So those are in the body points of trauma, in our mind cells that don't allow us to change, and all of us have them. So the first step is identifying them and then starting to think through where do I wish to be. So that's almost the next thing. Learning from the future, use future, and then the future I wish, the vision of the future. And systems oppress us so we really can even ask that I have the right to a vision of the future, a preferred future.
And I think that's the hard part, that part of being able to, especially when you've experienced a lot of oppression or you're from a community that is under brutal treatment. It's like, how do you do that? You know, how do you even give yourself permission to believe that you can have a future that you prefer?
Yes.
And you talk a little bit about borrowed futures, I remember was really interesting to me.
Yeah, there's the borrow. So there's almost like a colonized future. So we've borrowed them unconsciously. I can borrow futures from different traditions consciously because they make my tapestry enriched, more colorful. But a borrowed future is when I'm doing unconsciously, I adopt a future that's not me, that diminishes me. So colonization works by that, by framing a particular future as the future, as the inevitable future. So futures is saying, well, it's not inevitable. You have choice, agency. What are the alternative futures? So we can cast off the colonized, the borrowed future and create something far more authentic. Yeah. So borrowed could be forced or borrowed could be chosen. That's the issue there.
Yeah. Because when I look at say even like conversations around treaty and things like that, we often look to America and New Zealand around what's
Yes.
happening there because they're further ahead along in the journey. But I'm always I have seen even in the community where we have borrowed different aspects of things that don't really resonate here. And I think that conscious choosing of we choose and where we're unconsciously taking on something that's not really going to work for us. And how can we see ourselves as worthy enough to create our own?
Yeah, I mean, Japan's rise starts with the Meiji Restoration, where the Japanese leadership said, oh, we're far behind. They sent out ambassadors throughout the world and said, let's learn from everyone. And they came back and said, okay, now we're going to use their best practices to transform Japan. Then Japan rose till 1990. Their goal was catching up. Once they caught up, they had no new vision of the future. And thus the dynamism, the pull disappeared, as well as inability to attract other cultures and aging as systemic forces. So I think exactly how you're saying it. How do I give myself permission for a new future? And then find the strategy that works best. And that's often if the story is wrong. Because stories are stolen, we have to find the correct inner stories within our tradition and use them to jump to a new future. I remember my favorite story was one when I was working with teenagers. It was 8 teenagers and we were looking at their futures. And when we did the visioning, she wanted to be the CEO of a bubble tea company. And it was what a beautiful vision for a 15-year-old thinking about when she's 25 or 30. And then we asked her, what's your current metaphor? And she said, oh, I live in a room where the blinds are shut. And I said, why is that? So I can focus on science and mathematics so I can become a good CEO in 10 years. Now her friends were in the room, all started to cry at that moment. And then she looked at them and they looked at her. And then the tears were, you've shut us out for science and math. And as she reflected on that, she goes, aha, I need a plus strategy. So then her new metaphor is let the light in, let the sunshine in. And strategically what that meant is, yes, of course, to science and math, but also to emotional and spiritual intelligence. I've shut out ways of knowing which I thought aren't needed, but clearly any business book would tell you if you're going to be a good leader, it's science, math, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, spiritual intelligence.
Yeah.
And so that meeting, her tears led to this deeper understanding of, for her to get what she wanted to do, she had to expand. And having her friends there with her and me, I was just trying to stay out of the way. eight teenagers all crying. It's like just breathe and let them figure this out. The facilitator there was to not intervene. Is their story. And I think your earlier point, if we look at in this country, I do have to name names. If you look at Mr. Howard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why was he so successful? He understood the story of fear to win elections. In one election, he just put up a chart of interest rates, showing if you vote Labor, interest rates will go high. And he said, you'll lose your home. That was the thing. You'll lose your home. That worked. He won. The next election, he goes, well, now everyone has, now what do I do? So he just said churn overboard, even though there was no evidence of it. The idea is, we're going to be invaded. Vote for me. I'm the safe, secure one. So this is the power of story for, to me, non-compassionate, non-inclusive terms. Now, Labor, in contrast, always focused on policy, systemic level changes, a better economy, more transparency, and most Australians can't handle policy electioneering.
Yeah,
And
you're
this
right.
last,
They're really not good at selling a story, are they?
no, this
That
last election, they suddenly figured it out. All they said was, they said from Scott Morrison to ScoMo, Scotty from marketing. They just kept on saying Scotty from marketing. So that's the negative story, which was working. They said, well, what's our positive story? They said, well, we're not going to make the same mistake by talking about policy. All they did was chose the current prime minister to not say anything. Their story was small target. I'm not sure your listeners or we should be playing that game. We want to have stories that are powerful, that are inclusive, that are not based on fear, but based on the best we can all be. That's the longer term vision. Now, if they want to get in quick power, then of course stories in fear always work, as we've seen many prime ministers throughout the world do.
Yeah, and many workplace managers and
Yes,
at all
workplace. Yeah.
at all levels, you see the fear based stories driving driving people. And it's an interesting one because I think people get stuck too when we're trying to create a new story. We get stuck between the two. There's that scary, fearful story,
Yes.
or there's this option of what would love to be but may never be because it sounds like a bit of a pipe dream. And I
Yes.
think what you do and the work that you do and the methodologies you've created up is to help us create all these alternatives in between that are not necessarily pipe dreams or unrealistic, even though they may seem impossible. How would you do? Yeah, how do you describe those
So,
alternatives
so
that allow?
structurally, I think that's just a brilliant point there. So structurally, here's the methodology. We've done this many times. You start out with a preferred future. So I remember one in Brisbane 20 years ago. It was in this group. They're all cutting edge people. They talked about the green city, the gender equitable city, the livable city, the walkable city. Quite idealistic, quite, powerful
I,
but idealistic ideals, pipe dreams. And everyone loved it. And then we asked the second question, not the used future, because the used future was very clear, the city as a little town that doesn't include others, but the disowned future. This owned future is what are we pushing aside in our idealism? And people said there's nothing disowned. Then I had two people in the back of the room, engineers, and they said, you've disowned power and size. Large developers will come here to make money. You're talking about green livability, walkability, gender equity. They don't care. So the insight there, and this is the insight when we had with a large national bank, is they're not concerned about gender equity, but they do understand that their lending will be more powerful, lead to more prosperity. They'll get their KPIs if there's more gender equity. They'll do a better job. So in this case, given that people want power and wealth, the conclusion was, okay, if we want to sell green, gender equity, livability, we have to say this will lead to greater prosperity, more well-being, longer life. Capital will come here because they'll be attracted to that. So that became the third space. So the preferred, the disowned, and the integrated, which understood the necessity to include even the parts of reality we may be uncomfortable with, but our next steps in our strategy.
And I remember actually going back, oh gosh, it must have been before Chaya was born. So must have been around 2015. I did this process, but on a personal level. And I remember my ideal preferred future was I want this like holistic, balanced life, where everything's in harmony and I'm at home with my kids, but I'm in a purposeful job, all of these things. And it was just like, oh, love that. There was a part that I think with my disowned was like the martyr in me, the one that had to do everything.
Yes.
Example, and then I'm probably going to end up divorced the way I'm going. And then the third one,
It was
it
your
was like
perfectionist self, perfectionist martyr.
my perfection. Yeah,
Things must be perfect, so I will sacrifice for the good of all.
exactly. So I had these two worlds. Was that my disowned? Yeah, my disowned and my preferred. And then my integrated took me ages to work out how am I going to integrate that. And I came up with the metaphor different times for different lives.
Yeah,
So I
brilliant.
remember it be going, okay.
Mhm.
And I moved away from balance to realizing nothing's ever really in balance, but can I be in harmony with the imbalance while these
That's
different times played out? So it took me ages to get there because I was really stuck in those two binaries of like, I've either got to like sacrifice myself and give up everything, or I can just to have this, and it just never felt right, like I was getting anywhere. But that third, where I actually looked at what I was disowning, the other thing I realized was let the martyr out to play, but be conscious of
yeah.
it. Like, okay, that's there, and sometimes that needs space, and so let it play, but don't let it take over. I do have one more questions before I let you go, and it's actually from a listener. She wanted to ask the question, what are some of the scenarios that you are seeing potentially playing out based on her feeling that there's signs that democracies are getting weaker and the increasing conflicts around the world at the moment?
The way Western democracies work is democracy within, imperialism without.
Mhm.
And that's the challenge of the world system. We'll have electoral democracy within our country, but outside it's a Wild West, guns rule. That works until those people outside, if they also do the same, they get bombed. So then the systemic challenge is we're in a world that needs a new world regime, a world governance system. So right now, no action to protect occurs because one of the 5 members of the Security Council have veto power. So they veto anything that hurts their self-interest. So the challenge your listener is posing is a challenge we're all facing. How do we get 5 nation states who keep the veto power for their self-interest, even though it's against the interest of at least 7 billion people, against the interests of nature, and if we see the earth as a co-evolving spirit, against the earth as spirit. So this is the challenge of the many versus the few. The many want a different system, the few won't allow it. So this contradiction is real between democracy inside, Wild West outside, and this is something we have to resolve. If we don't resolve it with a new political, social, spiritual system, then Gramsci said it's the time of the monsters. And so this is the hard part of it, and I think you speaking as an indigenous Aboriginal woman would know that the monsters are everywhere. And
Yep.
it comes out in daily life, it comes out in systems, and it's coming out even more forthrightly in the world system. The world system, if you see it as a learning mechanism, has now become aware of it as a world.
Yeah.
So this is what's unique. We have awareness of it. How we're going to get the few to give up for the many is the issue I have no answer for. Is it appealing to their best nature, the Mandela approach? Is it using even more force, what the West did against Nazi Germany? Is it that the scenario? Is it the rise of small NGOs, groups everywhere saying we want a different world? That's the third one. Is it coalescing all that? That's also possible. But I think that your person he or she is onto it. This is the issue of the time, a new world system, a way of thinking, a mindset that helps us move forward as a species.
And knowing that, as you do, especially because of the work you do with so many different groups, how do you personally deal with that?
I think it's this, if we look at the futures world, our role is to create the new story, knowing full well we live in a world of used futures. The way you so eloquently talked about, I have to have harmony in the disharmony. That's exactly it. Yeah. I have to have some sense of inner peace in a world where there is violence. I have to have some sense of vision, optimism in a world where there's, yes, clearly negative trends. Just look at pollution. Right now, there's only 7 countries in the world WHO says are safe to live in. Australia, New Zealand, Estonia, Finland, and I think 2 others. That most countries in the world are no longer safe to breathe in. So that's where a few win over the many and cleared systems of production that don't work.
And it's an interesting time. It is an interesting time because I'm not an optimistic person. There is a game called the Polac game, where
Yes,
you
yeah.
have to go in those quadrants. Are you someone who
Yeah.
thinks you can create change and you think the world's changing for the better? I'm always in that quadrant that's like, what? And yet I am, and I'm not even very hopeful, but I do seem to find the way I deal with my anxiety around the uncertainty of the world and
Yes.
the times that we're in is very much, like you said, trying to find the harmony in the disharmony. And when I'm in it, to provide that space for others where the disharmony is not there, whether it's and they're very small things. But one thing I did learn, and I'll share this with you, Sal, when I was diagnosed with cancer back in 2019, all my 20s, I'd wanted to do big things. I'd want to do big projects. I don't know, like I want to change the world. And then I remember when I was in the hospital after my surgery, and a lady was walking past and she said, "Oh, can I rub your hands with some moisturizer?" And I was like, "Oh, sure." And she just sat on my bed quietly and she massaged my hands with moisturizer. And it was way too much moisturizer, but I remember just her her sitting on my bed. She had this mother energy, was so grounding, and then off she went to the next room, and she was doing the most simplest thing. And I remember it was a big lesson for me how those small things during big moments of upheaval, which I was going through, and uncertainty, how much they matter to create change. And it was like she shared the grounding stick with me. She sat on that bed and then she just passed me this little grounding thing. And I was like, and I still remember the rings on her hands. Her hands became I was so present with her. I still remember her hands. I can't remember her face, but I just remember her hands so vividly. And it just shifted me completely around how we navigate these times.
I mean, this is the mindful present. We can't change anything in the future, but if every day we're appreciative and we can serve one person, one act of service, so that creates the pebbles to roads to a better future. I think that your
Yeah.
example is perfect, and that's why
And it
every day I
actually,
try to think, what can I do? One thing good for someone.
yeah. And it actually allows you to see a clearer pathway emerging. Like when you can't see anything because the overwhelm's too much, or that zero loop learning you're talking about,
Yeah, yeah.
it, all of a sudden it just opens up to be able to kind of trust or see that, things can be different. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think that's all I wanted to ask you. If you could
Thank
share maybe one last thing, actually, how did you come into future studies? What made
so
you fall into it?
I
If
was
you fell
17. Yeah, I was fell into it. I was 17, moved to University of Hawaii, had started to do inner work, was looking for, since we grew up every 2 years, moved to a different country. It quickly became apparent every person in the country had someone else who was the other, who was evil. And by the time I was 17, it became very clear to me that obviously no one is evil, it's just systems and structures. And we have to have a way of thinking that includes everyone. In Sarkar, the Asian philosopher, his language, New Humanism. And I was a 17-year-old, there was someone teaching future studies at the University of Hawaii. And he had the same way of talking, how technology can transform us. We need a world governance system. We need to become different. We need to stop being stuck. And as you take one of those classes, like, oh my God, this is not traditional whatever field. It was a new field. So the innovation, the excitement, the optimism, the possibility of change was quite inspiring for me. And that was phase one. And phase two, we said, well, you need a tool bag as well. And so then it was methods and tools to do this with others and for myself.
Thank you so much for your time, Sahel. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
It was
great
lovely
talking with you, Cherie.
to and talk to you
And
soon.
look forward to
No,
seeing you as well.
it was like a disco in here with the light.
I liked it.